You think you're thinking right now, reading these words, processing their meaning, following the flow of ideas from one sentence to the next. But what if I told you that thinking is an illusion? What if the voice in your head, the stream of consciousness you experience every waking moment, is nothing more than a trick your brain plays on itself? What if there is no continuous you experiencing these thoughts? What if consciousness is not a smooth flow but a series of discrete snapshots, like frames in a movie with nothing but darkness between them? What if in the gaps between your thoughts, you simply don't exist? Let me show you what happens in those spaces between thoughts. And I promise you, what you discover there will change everything you believe about what it means to be conscious, to be alive, to be you. First, let's examine what you think a thought is. Right now, you're aware of reading these words. You might be thinking about what comes next. Perhaps you're wondering whether this is true. You experience this as a continuous stream, one thought flowing into another, a steady narrator in your head describing your experience. But here's what neuroscience reveals about what's actually happening in your brain. When you have what you call a thought, billions of neurons fire in complex patterns. Electrical signals race along neural pathways. Chemical neurotransmitters cross synapses. The activity spreads across different brain regions, creating temporary networks of communication. And then it stops. The neural pattern dissolves. The electrical activity fades. The chemical signals are reabsorbed. Your brain returns to its baseline state. There's a moment of quiet, a gap, a pause in the neural storm. And during that pause, where are you? Where is your consciousness? Where is the thinker who was just thinking? The disturbing answer is nowhere. You don't exist in the gaps between thoughts. Consciousness is not continuous. It's discrete. Like a strobe light flashing in a dark room, creating the illusion of smooth motion by freezing brief moments of illumination. Your sense of being a continuous self is a construction, a story your brain tells itself by stitching together these discrete moments of awareness. Think about this carefully. Right now, you feel like you've been continuously conscious throughout this entire experience of reading. But that continuity is an illusion created by memory. Each moment of consciousness contains not just present awareness, but also the memory of the previous moment. Your brain convinces itself that there was no gap because it remembers being conscious just a moment ago. But memory is not the same as continuity. When you watch a movie, you see smooth motion. But the film is actually a series of still images shown rapidly in sequence. The motion exists only in your perception, not in the physical reality of the film. Similarly, the continuity of consciousness exists only in your perception, not in the physical reality of your brain. Let's dig deeper into what neuroscience tells us about the timing of consciousness. When you decide to move your hand, your brain begins preparing for that movement several hundred milliseconds before you become aware of your decision. The neural activity that will cause your hand to move starts before you consciously experience the intention to move it. This suggests something profound and disturbing. The conscious experience of deciding is not the cause of your actions. It's a story your brain creates after the fact to explain what it's already started doing. You don't decide and then act. Your brain acts and then creates the conscious experience of having decided. The narrator in your head is not the director of the show. It's the commentator, describing events that have already been set in motion by unconscious processes. But it gets stranger. The feeling that you are the thinker of your thoughts is itself just another thought. When you think I am thinking, that's not you observing your thoughts from some central command center. That's just another neural pattern, another temporary configuration of brain activity. The observer and the observed are the same thing. The thinker and the thoughts are identical. This means there is no little person inside your head watching the show. No homunculus sitting in a theater of consciousness observing your experiences. The experiences are all there is. When you see red, there's no additional entity experiencing the redness. The redness is the experience. When you feel pain, there's no separate self that feels the pain. The pain is the totality of what's happening in that moment. Now let's consider what happens during sleep. For roughly 8 hours every night, your consciousness disappears completely. Not just the contents of consciousness, but consciousness itself. You don't experience the passage of time while you're deeply asleep. One moment you're lying down with your eyes closed, and the next moment you're waking up with no subjective experience of the hours in between. Where were you during those hours? The question seems absurd because obviously you were still there, still alive, still breathing. But from the perspective of consciousness, from the perspective of subjective experience, you were nowhere. You didn't exist. The stream of consciousness was interrupted for 8 hours, and then it resumed, creating the illusion that it had been running continuously. This nightly disappearance of consciousness reveals something crucial about its nature. Consciousness is not fundamental to your existence. Your body continues functioning without it. Your brain continues operating without it. Life goes on without consciousness overseeing every process. This suggests that consciousness is not the driver of your behavior, but rather an optional commentary track that sometimes gets turned on. But even during waking hours, consciousness is not as continuous as it seems. Every few seconds, your eyes make rapid movements called saccades as they dart from one fixation point to another. During these saccades, you are functionally blind. Your visual system shuts down to avoid the blur of motion, but you never notice these gaps in vision because your brain fills them in, creating the illusion of continuous sight. Similarly, your attention is constantly shifting from one thing to another. You can only consciously focus on one thing at a time, even though your brain is processing vast amounts of information simultaneously. Most of this processing happens unconsciously. You become aware of only a tiny fraction of your brain's activity. The rest operates in the darkness between conscious moments. This raises a fundamental question about the nature of identity. If consciousness is not continuous, if it disappears every night and flickers on and off throughout the day, then what makes you you? What connects the conscious moment you're experiencing now with the conscious moment you experienced this morning? They're separated by hours of unconsciousness, by millions of unconscious brain processes, by countless gaps in awareness. The answer that most people give is memory. You remember being you this morning, so you must be the same person. But memory is notoriously unreliable. Every time you recall a memory, you change it slightly. Your memories of childhood are not recordings of what actually happened, but reconstructions based on fragments of information, filled in with assumptions and influenced by subsequent experiences. Moreover, memory itself is not continuous. You don't remember every moment of every day. Large portions of your life have been forgotten completely. The you who experienced those forgotten moments is effectively dead, erased from your personal history. If identity depends on memory, then you are not the same person who lived through those forgotten experiences. But perhaps identity is not about memory or continuity of consciousness. Perhaps identity is about the physical continuity of your body, particularly your brain. The same neurons that were firing yesterday are mostly still there today, connected in mostly the same patterns. This physical continuity could be what makes you you, regardless of gaps in consciousness. However, this too is more complicated than it seems. Your brain is constantly changing. Neurons die and are not replaced. Synapses are strengthened or weakened, based on experience. New neural pathways are formed while others are pruned away. The physical structure of your brain today is significantly different from what it was 10 years ago. At the molecular level, the turnover is even more dramatic. The proteins that make up your neurons are constantly being broken down and replaced. The atoms that compose your brain are exchanged with the environment through metabolism. From a purely physical perspective, very little of the matter that makes up your brain today was part of your brain a decade ago. So if consciousness is not continuous, if memory is unreliable and incomplete, and if your physical brain is constantly changing, then what exactly persists from one moment to the next that could be called you? The uncomfortable answer might be nothing. The self might be an illusion created by the brain's tendency to create narratives and impose continuity on discrete experiences. This is where the investigation becomes truly disturbing. If you look closely at your experience right now, if you pay careful attention to the actual moment-by-moment flow of consciousness, you might notice that thoughts appear and disappear without anyone thinking them. They arise from nowhere, exist briefly, and then vanish back into nowhere. Try this experiment. Sit quietly and pay attention to your thoughts. Don't try to control them or direct them, just observe. Notice how thoughts seem to appear spontaneously. You don't create them intentionally, they just pop up. And notice how they disappear just as spontaneously. You don't consciously decide to stop thinking a particular thought. It just fades away and is replaced by another. Where do thoughts come from? If you trace backward from any thought, looking for its origin, you won't find a thinker who decided to think it. You'll find other thoughts, other experiences, other influences. But you won't find a central self that generates thoughts intentionally. Thoughts seem to generate themselves out of the complex interactions of neural networks operating below the threshold of consciousness. This suggests that what you call thinking is not something you do, but something that happens to you. Thoughts think themselves. Consciousness observes itself. The brain creates the experience of being a self-observing thoughts, but this observer is itself just another pattern of brain activity, another thought among thoughts. Now let's consider what this means for free will. If thoughts appear spontaneously without a central thinker generating them, and if the sense of being an agent making decisions is itself just another thought, then what happens to the idea that you are in control of your actions? If the decision to act begins in unconscious brain processes before you're aware of deciding, then in what sense are you the author of your actions? The implications are profound. It suggests that free will, like the continuous self, might be an illusion. Not because your actions are determined by external forces, but because there is no central you to have free will in the first place. Actions happen, decisions are made, thoughts are thought, but there's no little person inside your head making these things happen. They happen by themselves, out of the complex dynamics of neural activity. But here's what makes this even more mysterious. If there's no central self, if consciousness is not continuous, if thoughts think themselves, then who or what is aware of this? Who is having the experience of reading these words right now? If the self is an illusion, who is being fooled? This is the deepest mystery of consciousness. There is clearly something it is like to be conscious. There is undeniably an experiential quality to the moment you're living right now. But when you look for the experiencer, you find nothing but the experience itself. When you search for the observer, you find only the observed. When you seek the thinker, you discover only thoughts. The awareness that allows you to be conscious seems to be independent of the contents of consciousness. It's like space that allows objects to exist within it without being affected by those objects. Thoughts come and go in awareness, but awareness itself remains unchanged. Experiences arise and pass away, but the capacity for experience persists. This pure awareness, this consciousness without content, seems to be present in the gaps between thoughts. When one thought ends and before the next one begins, there's a moment of pure awareness with nothing in it. No thoughts, no experiences, no sense of self, just awareness itself, empty but present, like a clear sky with no clouds. But even this description might be misleading because it makes awareness sound like a thing, like a substance or a field. But awareness is not a thing. It has no properties, no location, no boundaries. It's more like the capacity for things to appear than a thing itself. It's the openness in which experience happens, not an experience itself. This brings us to perhaps the most profound realization of all. If awareness is what allows experience to exist, and if this awareness is not personal, not yours or mine, but simply the capacity for experience to occur, then the deepest aspect of what you are is not individual at all. It's the universal capacity for consciousness to exist. From this perspective, the gaps between thoughts are not empty spaces where you disappear. They're moments when personal consciousness dissolves back into the universal capacity for consciousness. The wave of individual awareness flattens back into the ocean of pure awareness. You don't cease to exist in these gaps. You return to what you always were beyond the temporary construction of selfhood. This suggests that death might not be the annihilation it appears to be. If what you fundamentally are is not the personal stream of consciousness, but the awareness in which that stream appears, then the end of your personal consciousness might be more like the end of a dream. The dream ends, but the capacity for dreaming remains. But let's bring this back to practical experience. If consciousness is discontinuous, if the self is constructed, if thoughts think themselves, how should this change how you live? Does it mean nothing matters, because nothing is real? Does it mean you should stop trying to make decisions because free will is an illusion? The answer is more subtle. Understanding the nature of consciousness doesn't make experience less real or less important. It just reveals what experience actually is, rather than what we assumed it was. A movie doesn't become less enjoyable when you understand that it's made of still frames shown in rapid sequence. The illusion of motion is still beautiful and meaningful even when you know it's an illusion. Similarly, the experience of being a self-making choices and having thoughts remains meaningful even when you understand its constructed nature. The story of your life is still your story, even when you realize it's being written by unconscious processes. The narrator in your head is still worth listening to even when you recognize it as a character rather than the author. What changes is your relationship to experience. Instead of being identified with the story, you can observe it with some distance. Instead of being trapped within the stream of consciousness, you can rest in the awareness that contains the stream. Instead of being the thinker lost in thoughts, you can be the space in which thinking occurs. This shift in perspective can be profoundly liberating. When you realize that thoughts come and go by themselves, you don't have to take them so seriously. When you understand that emotions are temporary patterns of brain activity, you don't have to be overwhelmed by them. When you see that the sense of being a separate self is constructed, you can relax the effort of maintaining and defending that construction. In the gaps between thoughts, in the space between experiences, there's a profound peace. Not the peace that comes from getting what you want or solving your problems, but the peace that's always present when you're not disturbed by the contents of consciousness. It's the peace of pure awareness, free from the burden of being someone specific, free from the effort of maintaining a continuous self. This is what happens between thoughts. Not emptiness in the sense of lack or void, but fullness in the sense of pure potential, the space from which all experience arises and into which all experience dissolves. The awareness that makes consciousness possible, but is itself beyond the contents of consciousness. And perhaps most remarkably, this awareness that you discover in the gaps between thoughts is not separate from the awareness that's reading these words right now. It's not something you have, but something you are. Not your awareness, but awareness itself, temporarily appearing as the experience of being you. The stream of consciousness, with all its thoughts and experiences, is like waves on the ocean. The waves are temporary forms that the ocean takes, but they're not separate from the ocean. When a wave subsides, it doesn't go somewhere else. It returns to being ocean. Similarly, when thoughts subside, they don't disappear into nothing. They return to being awareness. In this light, the gaps between thoughts are not periods when you cease to exist. They're moments when you return to your deepest nature. They're opportunities to recognize what you are beyond the temporary construction of selfhood. They're invitations to rest in the awareness that is your true identity. So the next time you notice a gap between thoughts, don't rush to fill it with more thinking. Rest in that space. Notice the awareness that remains present even when there's nothing to be aware of. Feel the peace that's always there when you're not disturbed by mental activity. Recognize the consciousness that makes all experience possible but is itself beyond experience. This is what Feynman's materialistic perspective points toward when followed to its logical conclusion. If consciousness is nothing but brain activity, if thoughts are nothing but neural patterns, if the self is nothing but a construction, then what remains when all of this is seen clearly? Not nothing, but everything. Not the absence of consciousness, but consciousness itself, free from the illusion of being personal, free from the burden of being continuous, free to be what it always was, the open awareness in which all of life appears. And in that recognition, the question of what happens between thoughts becomes irrelevant, because there are no gaps. There is only the continuous presence of awareness, sometimes filled with thoughts, sometimes empty of content, but always present, always aware, always what you most fundamentally are. The silence between thoughts is not empty space. It's pregnant. Pause in the cosmic conversation. It's the breath between words in the universe's ongoing soliloquy. It's the moment when the wave remembers its ocean, and you, dear consciousness, appearing as a reader of these words, are both the wave and the ocean, both the thought and the space between thoughts, both the temporary story of selfhood and the eternal awareness in which all stories appear and dissolve. That's what happens between thoughts. Not disappearance, but return. Not absence, but presence. Not silence, but the source of all sound. And recognizing this changes everything while changing nothing at all.